Welcome back. Welcome back to another episode of The Union. Last week we were off. We're back again. And guess what? We got a lot to talk about in a short period of time. I'm here with my sister, Carrie Rodriguez, again. So important that we have these conversations, that we engage parents, educators, activists, folks who really care about education at the local, state, federal level with information. Again, the union is here, something that we created because, first and foremost, we knew we needed it. What do we need? Up to date news on education, politics, policy, research, polling, and who's who in policy making. And so we're here with a great packed show. We're only here for 30 minutes. And so if you're on social media, you're following us, please share, like, call a friend, tell them to check in. This is where it's at. Carrie, how you been? You've been busy. What's been going on?
Man, I went on vacation last week and that feels like an
Yeah.
eternity ago now. And I've only been back for the last couple of days. But, Curtis, you're so right. The reason why we are doing this is actually because of days like this. There's so much happening. It's even breaking right now. We had six different Supreme Court rulings come out, two of which have some pretty profound impacts on education. We're in the middle of budget reconciliation, the bird bath. Things are coming and going. We had the budget markup. We had folks in committee yesterday. We had confirmation hearings for the Department of Education. So you got to be here on Fridays because we got to catch you up. Things are happening fast and furious, and if you're not here, you're going to miss it.
Yeah, I mean, I'll talk about today. We have Supreme Court. We have a new candidate, Democratic nominee for mayor out of New York. We have new things happening in states, places like Nevada. We have judges that are rescinding cuts to programs and policies, and we have some polling coming out. But in the short time we have, we want to jump right in. Carrie, you, National Parents Union, have been following what's happening on Capitol Hill, this so-called big, beautiful bill. We're in something called budget reconciliation. Talk about what that is, but also talk about this potential news about the education department closing and things that are happening. What are you hearing from Washington at the budget side, but also what's coming out of the Supreme Court?
Yeah, so we got to break down what's happening and give you the truth about what's going on with the so-called big beautiful bill, which to us is pretty much a big beautiful disaster. Um,
Yeah.
we we filled everybody in a couple weeks ago. We just did a major rally out there, and if you haven't had a chance to catch it, it's our brand new highlight reels featuring parents and teachers and advocates. Like it just came out, just hot off the press, so you want to catch up with that. But in terms of what's happening this week. We know that Republicans are trying to ram this thing through Congress. The headlines say that it might be stalled, but trust me, GOP leaders are hustling pretty hard to try to get this to President Trump's desk by July the 4th. So here's the deal. Republicans hold 53 seats in the Senate, and they only need 51 votes because budget reconciliation rules let them bypass the filibuster. So if there's a 50-50 tie, Vice President Vance can come in and break it in their favor. So basically, they can only afford to lose about three Republican votes, and that's pretty tight. So right now, Senators Rand Paul and Ron Johnson are leaning hard no because the bill still explodes the deficit. For all this talk about cutting down the deficit, looking for waste, fraud, and abuse. This will add about $2 to $3 trillion to the national deficit. So you got to look past the hype. On the other side, there's some moderates like Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, Josh Hawley, Jim Justice, and Tom Tillis. They are all worried about deep Medicaid cuts that would hurt seniors, kids, and people with disabilities. That's why you saw the National Parents Union, Educators for Excellence, a whole bunch of us, EdLock, we were all in those offices. In fact, just this week with Lisa Murkowski bringing in parents via Zoom so that she could have a conversation about some of the big issues in this bill. But here's where it gets really messy. There's something called the bird bath. And under
Mm.
the bird rule, this is what everybody's talking about this week. Under the bird rule, anything included in a reconciliation bill has to be directly tied to federal spending or revenue. And it's all named after late Senator Robert Byrd, who fought to keep, the extra fat and policy changes out of budget bills. So the Senate parliamentarian, you're hearing a lot about her. She's basically the referee. She's the keeper of the rule book, and she reviews every single section of the bill and decides what stays and what goes. And that's what we're talking about right now. It's called the bird bath. So this week, the parliamentarian scrubbed out several provisions that Republicans tried to sneak into this budget reconciliation bill. Number one, a Medicaid provider tax to help states support rural hospitals, restrictions on Medicaid funding for gender affirming care, limits on immigrants using Medicaid, Medicare, and CHIP. And one that we have been watching closely, the Education Choice for Children Act, or ECHA, which would have pumped money into private school voucher programs through a backdoor scheme of tax credits for donations to scholarship organizations. So ECHA would have been a massive expansion of private school vouchers, kind of a Trojan horse there, funneling public dollars away from public schools and using tax credits as the workaround here. And that was thrown out. It was drowned in the bird bath because it did not have a direct budget impact. It did not have that direct connection. It was a policy change. So we're going to watch this closely. For those of us who were deeply concerned about this, it was really good news. But, it remains to be seen whether or not they yank this back and they decide to reword it. And frankly, we are hearing some kind of movement from John Thune around, well, we're just not going to listen to the Senate parliamentarian this time. We're just going to push this through, and he's going to bring it to a vote, and he doesn't care what she says. So these are unprecedented times, Curtis, but that's the latest, and we're all watching the bath real close.
Well, I mean, this is so important because there's so much happening in foreign policy. There's happening here on immigration here in this country. And these are important to a lot of communities. We want to make sure that you are paying attention to the things that are most important to you, but also not losing sight on things that can impact you at the school level in this coming school year, over the summer, and moving forward. So why is this important to families, cuts in SNAP and Medicaid? Like, why do you think the parents should be paying attention to what's happening on Capitol Hill right now?
Well, I got to be honest, Curtis, parents really are paying attention, and you're seeing a lot of us showing up at town halls. They're even stopping members of Congress like in CVS. I just saw a great video of parents saying, like, hold on a second. Can we talk about this? Because we're really concerned about losing our health care or impacts to the safety net, because that's really where the rubber is going to meet the road here. Like, the safety net for American families is under attack. So when we're talking about healthcare, that could yank healthcare away from about 16 million families across the country. And these are families that are really, in a tough spot. And again, when we were just down in DC meeting with John Thune's office and Chuck Schumer's office, we brought parents in directly who would be impacted by this. In particular, one of our parents from Texas who has a child with cerebral palsy that had to rely on Medicaid. Another parent representing the Rocky Boy Reservation in Montana, talking about how her child actually passed away because she was floundering on these Medicaid wait lists to try to even just get health care. So this is really going to have direct impact on the nation's children and American families. And if you're tuning in here and you're saying, I'm trying to talk to Carrie and Curtis because I want to hear about education. Folks, it's the kids who are sick, kids who are hungry, kids who don't have a safe place to live, they cannot learn. And so when they show up in classrooms, it really does impact education and the ability for us to make progress, because education is the hope we have for the future, that we're not going to be repeating these cycles of poverty and all of the things that we're trying to fight up against. So if you're sitting there saying like, oh, that sounds terrible, but what has that got to do with me? It's got a hell of a lot to do with the work that we do in education, for sure.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. I mean, every generation has to reclaim the rights that oftentimes our ancestors, we thought, secured for us. And every win requires, protection of the win, ensuring that win is funded, that they're not pushed back for that win. And every generation has to fight for new things. And so again, we've been fighting for a long time. And this is why this show is important, because we want you to sort of gear up on what's happening, but also how you can get engaged, particularly as it relates to what's happening on Capitol Hill. At the same time, right across the street is the Supreme Court. Like you could, I mean, literally, if you've been to Washington, you literally walking across the street, you probably park near the Supreme Court to go to Capitol Hill, to the visitor center. And there's news out of the Supreme Court today as well that you've been following. This Mahmoud versus Taylor case. That's I think one that could impact teaching and learning in classrooms in a major way moving forward. So, what are you hearing about that, and what are your remarks on what this case, what the case was for? What was that? What was that an argument? But what does this mean for education and particularly parents?
Yeah, I mean, this one has really become a flashpoint in the national debate over parents' rights and inclusive education. And this is basically, where we see the culture war showing up in classrooms. So, a group of parents in Montgomery County, Maryland, challenged the local school district's policy on requiring elementary school students to participate in lessons that included LGBTQIA storybooks, arguing that that would violate their religious freedom. The school district had initially allowed parents to opt out of the lessons, but later removed that option, citing classroom disruption, saying that that was just going to be so disruptive. And frankly, this wasn't about indoctrinating kids. It was literally just including families that were also LGBTQIA in storybooks, et cetera. But the parents claimed that this forced their children to hear messages that undermined their faith, and that was a violation of their First Amendment rights. Lower courts actually sided with the school district, saying that exposure was not coercive. So just the fact that LGBTQIA people showed up and were present and acknowledged as existing was not an indoctrination or an endorsement or an undermining of their belief. So today, the Supreme Court, one of 6 decisions that came out, man, this is rapid fire today, but they reversed that decision. They granted a preliminary injunction in ruling that the parents' right to direct the religious upbringing of their children had been unconstitutionally burdened. The court compared the situation to Wisconsin versus Yoder, concluding that forced participation in LGBTQIA inclusive lessons without opt-outs would substantially interfere with the parents' ability to pass on to their beliefs. Now, from our perspective, this was never about protecting children. It was all about imposing one group's belief on every family and stripping schools of the ability to reflect the diversity of the real world. And from my perspective, I'm always going to defend the right of a parent to raise their child in the way that they choose, but not at the expense of someone else's. Inclusion does not mean indoctrination. And no child should be taught that their identity or their family is something to be hidden or ashamed of, or we need to protect another group of children from. That is where the problem really lies. So, in my view, no child's harmed by learning that LGBTQIA people exist, but what is harmful is a system that treats families like they don't belong.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so glad that you're speaking up for this. That parents are actually being included, and not just sort of a small segment of parents, but we're having conversations in a place like Montgomery County, Maryland, which is very not far from me. A pretty liberal county in a pretty liberal state like Maryland, that we're having these conversations. And so I'm so glad we're having these debates, but also that the judicial branch is also taking these things up. There's things happening in Washington, but there's also things happening around the country that we want to get to. And one of the biggest news stories of this week was happening out of New York City, the largest city in the country, with the largest school district in the country. And they had a candidate for mayor that was sort of written off. No one really gave a chance. But so many people were paying attention because they understand what happens in New York, and particularly what happens in the Democratic Party, will shape what happens over the next 2, 3, 4 years. Because as the party really trying to create a message, particularly in education, to respond to what parents around the country are asking for, they're looking for direction. And particularly in New York, Zohran Mamdani is now the Democratic nominee for mayor out of New York. And so folks say, who is this guy? We got to Google this guy. I never heard of him. And most people
I don't know, Curtis. Somebody, if you're on TikTok, man, folks, and we're live on TikTok right now, People were hot on him. I mean, that catchy little thing they had, my name is Mamdani,
Uh,
Mamdnei. Like,
okay.
we were hip to it, man. Like, so the TikTok crew and how they're just using different avenues. So we gotta lure you into the
Yeah.
TikTok crew here.
So those know we're live on TikTok right now. Those of you who are watching us on Instagram or on Twitter, on Facebook, on LinkedIn, we're also on TikTok right now. But for those who don't know, but he is an assemblyman from Queens, New York, someone who graduated from a public school in New York, Bronx Science, which is one of those schools that you test into, and we'll talk about that. He's also a former tutor and someone who's really been fighting against sort of what he calls racial and gender bias in these specialized high schools. So those of you not familiar with New York City, there's a test that students have to take, and there's a sense that these schools are sort of segmenting folks. What has he done in the past, sort of as an assemblyman? So he sponsored a bill to really overhaul how schools handle misconduct, and we've talked about this in previous shows. What's happening on legislation to ensure that we're not disproportionately penalizing, particularly Black and Latino young girls, but also young boys in disciplinary action. So what he did is, he's banning suspensions for minor infractions like tardiness and dress code, but also requiring schools. This is in his as a state assemblyman to require schools to train on restorative justice. It's something that I think people around the country in education understand is incredibly important. Where does he stand on teachers unions? Ones that I think a lot of people want to understand. Well, he didn't get the endorsement, but no one else did in the campaign as well. United Federation of Teachers, which is the city's second largest union, declined to endorse a candidate because of so many candidates. He's also in the past really supported students with disabilities, and has said that in order to respond to those students, it's really about how we respond with, as he calls them, a lot of people are saying, and the science agrees, this high dosage tutoring, ensuring that we have that one-on-one connection, but also the research around high dosage tutoring is having the same person over time consistently, and also connecting with them in the school building. He's also really passed legislation. Sorry, he really pushed, legislation at the city council level around increasing wages for paraprofessionals, but also increasing wages for those who are child care workers. So his issue is really around being able to afford to live in New York. And we talked about this a few weeks ago. More and more teachers can't afford to teach, can't afford to live where they teach. And so his campaign was really around not just sort of, the issues that people are dealing with around education, the environment, transportation. It's, can you afford to live here? Can you stay here? Are you getting paid enough to stay here? And so this is a lot else happening around how he messaged, his campaign, and that it's an example. Again, those who are in New York City are really talking about particularly his views on this so-called specialized high school admissions test, and his, potentially he may end that, which is this examination that to some appears to segregate the high schools. But let me just give the full picture here. There have been some research that says that in the selective high schools, they are economically diverse. That 50% of the students at schools like Stuyvesant and schools at like Bronx Science are from economically disadvantaged communities. So there's potential, diversity there. But I think for him, even being a student of one, has said this is something that we want to address. But again, putting, affordability, and then the ability to pay for transportation, to live where you work, is one that really got people's attention, Carrie, and got him a surprise win over a pretty popular field of candidates. But for those who are watching around the country, this is something you want to pay attention to, because this is how other candidates around the country who are trying to win back votes, particularly with parents and students and teachers, are going to be emulating. You've been following this as well. What have you been hearing about Mr. Mamdani?
Well, actually, I've been talking to a lot of New York City teachers about him because they had the opportunity to bring him into a mayoral forum to talk about one of their biggest and most important priorities and initiatives that they got done in New York, which is New York City Reads. And so they were actually really encouraged by the fact that he is a supporter of New York City Reads and a lot of the similar math efforts that are now getting underway, and really wanted to engage with teachers. So, New York City teachers, and shout out again to my friends at Educators for Excellence, who were really involved in this mayoral race and the process, and wanting to make sure that the voices of educators were heard loud and clear in this race, holding his feet to the fire and getting him to get on the record in terms of his support for literacy efforts that teachers have been fighting for in New York City. And you know me, I like to get a little bit of the tea. Like, okay, guys, so what's really going on with politics in New York City and education? And a little birdie told me that he actually doesn't have the best relationships with the New York City Teachers Union.
Okay.
And I guess the head of the New York City's Teachers Union was not really a fan, which is a little surprising, given his connection to the Democratic Socialists and their long times or ties with labor. So it's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out and whether or not this is going to be a fight between DSA and traditional union power in New York City. You know me, I'm a former 1199 SEIU New York leader myself, and part of that, proud to be a part of that organization for a very long time and seen the power of unions directly in New York City. But sometimes there's a fight. There's a
Yeah.
back and forth. So it's going to be interesting to see how that shakes out. But there is a strong commitment from teachers in New York to make sure that those voices are in the mix, that the priorities of teachers and parents are actually heard in this potential upcoming administration. We'll have to see what happens, in the general, and what happens with Eric Adams and all of that, because there's still a race to be run here.
Yeah.
And whether or not education actually comes out on top will be interesting to see, but they're committed and they're doing the work to make sure that they're in the mix.
Now, this is important because, I mean, for him to win a nomination without the support of the union, entity that a lot of people think the Democratic Party is sort of tethered to, as you can't win without them. Um, and which is, I think, in some cases, again, some corners, people think that it's hampered them from being more aggressive, more innovative on things that parents are talking about, like public charter schools and others, is one that I think people are paying attention to. And
Oh,
again,
it definitely does, Curtis. That's the
yeah,
whole reason why I feel like we can't make progress. Like
yeah,
I mean, and I make no bones about it. I was a longtime member of the Democratic State Committee in Massachusetts, but watching Democrats in my party fail and have, not have the political courage to stand up and even have their own ideas about education. It's like they outsource everything over there. It was really heartbreaking to see that. So, it's going to be important that he finds and maintains a backbone on education so that we can make actual progressive progress for kids, because that's what's lacking in a progressive movement, an actual progressive vision in education.
yeah. Again, folks, again, pay attention. What's happening in New York? Again, there'll be a general election, but as candidates are running, there are candidates around the country who are watching what's happening in New York and how um, Johan had really ran his race, what he talked about, who was on his team, how he talked about the age and the youth vote in New York. This is going to have ripple effect across the country. So those, please pay attention. We're almost done, but we want to talk about some of the things that we are tracking and what's happening around the country, particularly, this recently I talked about the impact that cuts to AmeriCorps are going to have to public schools and in some cases public charter schools, because so many of them who, particularly public charter schools that are underfunded, rely on support from groups like this. We had on Tasha James, who runs Legends Charter School here in Maryland. She had 25 AmeriCorps volunteers who are working in her schools, starting organizations, helping with reading and math, that were cut because of funding coming out of the administration. At the same time, your district judge granted a temporary block to those AmeriCorps cancellations of grants, but only in the 2 dozen or so states that actually were party to the case. The order requires the Trump administration to restore AmeriCorps grant funding to those places. And so the judge did also allow, unfortunately, AmeriCorps to proceed with reduction in force of the more than 500 full-time federal workers. Now, I mean, what does this mean? Initially, the termination of AmeriCorps funding shuttered more than 1,000 programs and prematurely ended 32,000 AmeriCorps volunteer members, service. And so there's a rolling back a little bit, but there's still going to be a sort of condensing of staff at the federal level. You're also hearing about what's happening at the Department of Education, Carrie. What are you hearing about, the administration's case to close, or at least particularly dramatically downside, the Department of Education?
We are literally waiting minute by minute. I have one eye kind of in the corner here. I've got dual screens, another iPad here where I'm tracking minute by minute, waiting to hear what happens. But we obviously, as parents and families, very invested in this, help to recruit some of the plaintiffs with Democracy Forward to challenge the potential closure of the U.S. Department of Education and the RIF, the reduction in force, as they call it. And frankly, this is having implications right now. The fact that they just went through and cut all of this funding. There are people who right now, we were hearing from a lot of our folks actually in Kansas and Missouri about the cutting of summer programs that was happening right now in real time because Title I Part C dollars were not being released. Frankly, there are folks across the country now who are waiting with bated breath for July 1st, which is the deadline for the remainder of this funding to come down. This is going to hit folks right now. It's not going to be in the fall. It's not going to be in 2026. This is funding that should have been flowing, and it's just not. And that is leading to the closure of summer camps and summer programs for kids. And this is going to be a real problem. But speaking of breaking news, there's also something pretty big that just happened with SCOTUS. And yet another case, FCC versus Consumer Research. This was the big case that was about rural broadband and access for schools, for libraries, for rural areas and low-income communities. We're talking about universal access to the internet because that is a huge problem. Frankly, this was going to be a disaster for school budgets because you think about it, this subsidy that they were getting from the feds would have gone away. It would have been a disaster, but the Supreme Court just upheld the funding structure of this federal program, says it has to move forward. So if you're a school, you're a library, you live in a rural area, or a local income, or you're a low income community, you're going to continue to be able to have access to the internet. Thank goodness.
No, thank you for keeping us up. I mean, your phone rings. I was wondering whether you're getting calls from people on the ground. Again, we're live, folks. I mean, this is not tape delay. We are not AI, and so we're getting news up to date to give it to you so that you can follow up on it week to week. One more thing I'm tracking, particularly, is Nevada. Nevada could see this fall up to 12 new charter schools, including a Hebrew language immersion school in Henderson, but also a sports-focused school in North Las Vegas with plans to partner with the Vegas Golden Knights and the Las Vegas Raiders. This is important because this is the first year in which the city of Henderson and North Las Vegas are considering overseeing charter schools. So those in Nevada, this is something that pay attention to. Previously, cities and counties were not permitted to be charter school authorizers, but that changed in 2023 through legislation sponsored by Governor Joe Lombardo. And so, again, there are things happening at the state level in places like Nevada around the country that are going to dramatically change the options that parents have, the school models that people are accessing, and the schools that people that educators teach at. If there's something to say, I'm an educator, I would love to teach at a sports focused school. I think my son, if he found out about this now, he'd probably be like, well, Dad, we didn't bring one of those to Maryland.
I was going to say, Curtis, you got to warn me because my kid's going to hear you about this brand new school. I'm going to end up packing up and moving to Nevada pretty soon because you think about a sports center charter. Oof.
There's a competition right there. And so before we go, again, I'm tracking that. We'll have more information about that in coming weeks. Before we go, we cannot leave without recognizing our legislative champion. Every week, we want to recognize someone who's in office who we believe is really standing up for children, for parents, for educators. And this week, you have someone, Carrie. Who's our legislative champion for this week?
Yeah, I'm actually really excited about this. I'm going to call him a young man. He's young in office. You know, he's probably our age, Curtis. But our legislative champion this week is freshman Representative Ron Stewart of Tulsa, Oklahoma. He was just recognized by the Oklahoma Institute for Child Advocacy as their Freshman of the Year. This is a guy who is a proud father of three. He's a firefighter and a paramedic. He was a paramedic and firefighter for about 20 years before he got in the mix, and he got interested in elected leadership after the pandemic and watching his kids struggle. So they are just watching him as a rising star because he's got an unwavering commitment to education and parent advocacy. And literally from the minute he stepped into office, he's been prioritizing strengthening public schools, pushing for increased per pupil funding, resources for educators, expanded mental health supports for students, and really doing this with the lens and the heart of a dad who's stepping up and making sure that the kids are going to be all right. So congratulations, Ron, on your awards and recognition, and you get a shout out from us as well.
Go Dads. You know me. When I hear dads, instant connection. And thank you so much, and congratulations to Representative Stewart. Thank you so much for all you're doing for the people of Oklahoma. That's our show. We're wrapping, but one more thing. We're on the road next week.
We are.
Next Tuesday, Carrie and I are going to be in Orlando, going live 9:00 at the National Charter School Alliance Conference in the convention center, where you're going to be having all of the people walking around. You'll be able to see us live 9:00 to 10:30. The Union Podcast. Curtis Valentine, Carrie Rodriguez, right there on Tuesday, talking to charter leaders, charter founders, charter educators about what's happening in their school, in their state. What are they concerned about? What are they excited about? What are they doing that could be replicated? I'm looking forward. We'll be together in person there in Orlando. I'm looking forward to it. Looking forward to it too, Carrie.
I am. And I'm going to put out a warning to all of our friends who are going down to Orlando. If you are there and you don't come by and hug my neck, I'm going to be big mad. So you better stop by and you better sit down and let's cut it up for a few minutes. We got time for you. It's going to be an extended edition of this show.
And other conferences, if you want to bring a union pod to your conference, you want me and Carrie to pull up and interview folks and talk about what's happening in education for parents, for students, for educators, please let us know, DM us and let us say, hey, bring the podcast live. We want to interview folks. We want to hear what's happening in education. This is the place to be. This is our 4th episode. Thank you all who've been joining us. Like, share, comment, the Union Podcast. Again, we'll give you back the rest of your Friday. Thanks so much for joining us, Carrie. Good seeing you. I will see